Okay, here we go. Welcome to another episode of Phantology. This is Steven, and I have Josh along with me. And today we're going to be reviewing an entire series. This is an 8-book series plus one, potentially. Right, Josh?
Yeah, well, I think 7 books plus some comics that I haven't read all
Okay,
of the comics. Yeah,
I'm close. Once you get into that high of number of books in the series, it doesn't really matter, right?
yeah, that's kind of how I feel. You're just in it for the long haul.
So the series we're talking about is Stephen King's Dark Tower series, not the Black Tower. Fans of Wheel of Time, I'm sorry, it's not Black Tower, it's Dark Tower. I'm probably going to make the mistake, so just bear with me.
Yeah, I made the mistake tons of times when I started picking it up. I constantly referred to it as Black Tower, so we'll forgive you, Stephen, if you refer to it as Black Tower during this podcast.
And this is a series that I personally have not read. In fact, I've never read any Stephen King. So, yeah, I'm totally in the dark here. So, treat this podcast as someone who is interested but knows nothing, interviewing an expert or interviewing at least someone who has read the series. And honestly, I didn't even realize that Stephen King wrote fantasy. That's how much in the dark I am.
Okay, so a few thoughts on this to start. First of all, I would generally classify almost all of Stephen King's book into the broader label of fantasy. Like they're definitely horror, but all of that obviously has a fantastical element. You know, if you've seen classic things like The Shining or Carrie or Green Mile or any of these things that have been made into movies and are some of the biggest books that have been written this last century, like they all have some aspect of the supernatural in them. So I think that you can broadly classify all of his books into fantasy, but The Dark Tower is his take on like what if Stephen King wrote The Lord of the Rings. So that is his take on kind of the more high fantasy, although it still stays kind of low fantasy, which we'll get into more of that later.
Yeah, and I have not read or even really watched many Stephen King books or movie adaptations. I'm not much for the horror genre. I did get trapped at one of my friends' houses in high school and watched Carrie, and I was traumatized. And one of my friends, for the rest of my senior year of high school, would try to scare me by creeping up and saying, "I'm Carrie White."
Can you give me this friend's initials? I have not heard this story.
LP. His initials are
Oh, okay.
LP.
Okay, I
He's
know.
been outed.
Okay, all right.
Maybe the full story will have to go up on Patreon.
Okay, sounds good. So I think the first Stephen King movie I ever watched was Shawshank Redemption or Green Mile. I can't remember which one. And so that is maybe like the least amount of fantasy that he has in his books. So I didn't really connect the dots, but still a great movie. Anyway, I have become more and more of a Stephen King fan this last year. So what happened, my journey with reading Stephen King, is I picked up the first book in the Dark Tower series maybe 2 years ago and tried reading it. And I got through it. And then I said, I need to read other Stephen King books before I keep going with the Dark Tower. So I read some of the classics. I read It, The Shining, Doctor Sleep. Which other ones did I read? Pet Cemetery, Carrie, Jerusalem's Lot. So I read some of the bigger books by him. And then I felt much more prepared to go into reading the rest of the Dark Tower series.
Yeah, it sounds like you're somewhat of an expert. I mean, I know Stephen King is very prolific in churning out books, but you listed off maybe 10 or so books. I mean, and then also
Yeah,
the 7 or 8 books of Dark Tower.
yeah, I've tried to make it a staple of my reading in the last year or year and a half.
Okay.
I feel like I'm not like a Stephen King. Like you can go deep with Stephen King stuff, and I have not gone deep with it. But I feel like I've definitely gotten a taste of Stephen King and like know what people talk about when they talk about Stephen King's tone and character work. And I feel like I can have educated conversations now after reading those.
So I guess 2 points here from me. I know that the Dark Tower, like you said, is his kind of take on Lord of the Rings, as if it was written by Stephen King. But it's also somewhat of a multiverse, kind of like a small version of Sanderson's Cosmere. Like, there's a lot of crossover between some of these books. How in your face are these crossovers? Is it really apparent that this is happening, or is it more just in the background?
Okay, so that is a great question. And I'm going to save part of my answer for more when we move into a little bit more spoilery part of the conversation. I want to keep this part totally spoiler free. But it retcons a lot of his earlier work. It pulls some characters and one character very specifically, it like pulls him out and he like becomes part of the main story. So mostly it's in references to his other works. with some characters being just pulled straight out of their stories from his other works and put into the Dark Tower.
So you use some slang there. Retcon. Retcon means what? Retroactively.
Connected.
What? Connect. Okay.
Yeah, I
Okay.
believe that's the term. Yeah. So it's like, okay, here's an idea that probably wasn't initially meant to be used for this purpose, and then it's retconned in by another plot element going back and pulling it.
So I feel like stuff like that, if it was from another author, would be heavily criticized. Does Stephen King just get away with whatever he wants at this point because he's Stephen King?
Yeah, kind of. I
Okay.
mean, like J.K. Rowling retcons stuff in Harry Potter too. Like she'll release, a side book about like the classes in the Harry Potter world and like fills in some plot hole. It's a pretty common thing I'd say authors do.
And she's had some criticism
Yeah, that's a good
from
point.
this type of stuff.
So before we get into spoilers, I just wanted to give a content warning for people thinking about the series. So this series and Stephen King in general probably has the most content of anything we've reviewed on Fantology, I'd say. Now, having said that,
Even more than like a Joe Abercrombie.
yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Well, so not in. It's weird the way Stephen King does it because while there is like explicit violence and sex and everything, he doesn't linger on it as long as like Joe Abercrombie does, maybe. So like if something gruesome happens, it like happens and then it's over. If that makes sense.
So you're saying Joe Abercrombie's grimdark tone is one that would linger on those things and really reinforce kind of like the grim nature of humanity and existence, but Stephen King is just like, this is happening because it's part of the books and the plot, and on we go.
Yeah, although it really does serve to set a very unique tone to Stephen King. I'd say that, I mean, when you're reading Stephen King, you're reading horror, and obviously it's hard to like get jump scares in a book. So a lot of the horror elements come from the tone that Stephen King sets. With the like sexual content warning, there's a lot of sexual content, although it's not like it's weird because it's not like it's meant to be like erotica. It's not like meant to really like turn you on. It's like meant to show like how perverse people can be, if that makes sense. So there's there's sexual violence in the books. There's just references to a lot of different sex acts. There's a lot of content, but it's not meant to be erotic.
Okay.
But it's present.
Very, very full content warning there. We're not shying
Yeah,
away from anything in these.
and if you've read other Stephen King books, you'll know what I mean by that.
Okay. And like you say, and everyone knows, Stephen King writes horror, and horror has violence and all kinds of things, obviously, just kind of ingrained right there in the genre.
Yeah. So just big content warning. These books aren't for kids, I don't think at all. I'd hesitate on giving it to any kid under the age of 16 for sure. And they're adult books. So make your decision for your kids, but know that they're adult books.
Now, before we get into spoilers, I also wanted to ask you, so you said Stephen King writes fantasy to some degree because he writes horror. How would someone like myself, who is very familiar with epic fantasy and urban fan, I mean, I'm familiar with really all types of fantasy other than horror, other than the Stephen King type, other than this flavor of it, right? So what would my impression be going in? How can I find out if this is for me? Any recommendations there?
I'd say almost do what I did. You can read the first book. The first book isn't that long, and it gives you an idea of what the main character Roland is all about. But then go read other Stephen King works because maybe just a few of them, definitely like Jerusalem's Lot, maybe because there's a main character that comes from that book and is placed into the series, and you really have to have an idea of like Stephen King's subversion of tropes, how he likes to take typical tropes and turn them on their head. And then also you get to know a little bit of Stephen King's shortcomings as an author through reading his other works that then will make you hate some aspects of the Dark Tower less.
Okay. And I know it's a pretty controversial series, right? In terms of
Yeah,
opinion.
yeah, oh yeah. I will say that compared to something like the Stormlight Archive or Wheel of Time or just any other high fantasy book series that has tons of characters, tons of different plot threads, this is a series that is very focused on a core group of people. It doesn't expand that out a ton. You get kind of random perspectives throughout the series, but it's very much more centered on a core group of people and their journey through the series. So it's much more intimate than expansive.
Okay, which is, yeah, that's a huge difference
Yeah,
because epic fantasy is epic in every way, and one of those ways is the cast of characters. I mean, Wheel of Time has, I don't even know how many characters it has. Thousands? It's got to have
yeah.
thousands, right?
I think that there's over 1,000 named characters in the Wheel of Time. Yeah.
So you're saying Dark Tower has like 10?
Well, I mean, named characters more than that, but of the characters you really care about. So let's start moving into maybe like yellow status spoiler territory. Like, I'm not going to give away plot elements, but I'm going to talk about themes and what I think Stephen King does really well and some shortcomings. So if you want to go into this story completely blind to all of those things, then you might want to stop listening. But I'm not going to give away any like plot details from here on out.
Okay, so you're not going to do any red plot level spoilers for any of the books then?
No, I'll keep. I mean, I'm going to talk about characters that are introduced in like the second and third book, but I won't talk about what happens to that character. I'll just say that they're introduced.
Okay, and this might be a good time to do a little mid-roll ad for Phantology because I neglected to start off. So if you like the content that Phantology is putting out, check us out on social media at Phantology Books or on our website, www.phantologybooks.com. And we have a Discord server, so hop on there if you're a big Stephen King fan and tell us what we did wrong. Tell us what your opinions are of the podcast. And if you really like us, you can hop on Patreon. I know, Josh, you just uploaded your raw reaction,
Yeah,
not spoiler free,
yeah.
spoiler filled.
Spoiler filled initial. Like literally, I finished the series. I came down and I recorded my thoughts. So I have my thoughts a little bit more centered now, but that is just my initial reaction. It's up on Patreon right now.
Nice. Sounds like it's full of hot takes and sounds like like something that a big Stephen King fan probably needs to hear, right?
Oh, I'll get torn apart by big King fans. Actually, yeah, I went back and I watched Daniel Green's. He did the same thing where he sat down and we kind of had a similar reaction, although he was a little bit more overall positive than I was. But it's a very mind blowing ending.
Okay. Yeah, he kind of tends to be, but I guess
Yeah,
that's his brand on YouTube.
yeah.
And also, I can't neglect to say shout out to our recent Patreon supporters, Lucian DC and Bridge Boy on Discord. You can find them there, although Lucian just changed his handle to King of the North.
Yeah, come join the conversation. We have a lot of fun in there.
Okay, on to the series then. So I don't know anything about the series. You're not going to do any specific plot point spoilers. So let's just start with kind of broad strokes. What is this series? I know you compared it to Lord of the Rings, if Lord of the Rings was written by Stephen King and it had horror aspects to it.
Okay, that's a good foundation. So the series starts with Roland traveling through the desert, and he's on a mission to get to the Dark Tower. That's how everything's framed. And in the first book, he's on a mission to find the Man in Black and to get information out of the Man in Black. And so the first book is really hyper focused on Roland. You get some flashbacks from Roland's life. You get an adventure that he goes on through the town. It feels kind of like a Western where he goes to this middle of nowhere town and has a little showdown in this town. And so the first book is very focused on Roland.
Does he protect the town from invaders?
No.
Okay. So it's not quite a Western then.
Yeah, there's another book in the series where it's like that typical of Western where there's like a small town that his group goes to and protects from invaders. But this is where he subverts that trope.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is Roland is the titular gunslinger then? Gunslinger is the title of the first book, yeah?
Yep. So
Okay.
Roland is a gunslinger. He's last in the line of L. So he's basically like the last in the line of King Arthur's court.
Okay.
And so he's traveling through and he's trying to be on this epic journey to get to the Dark Tower.
So it sounds like we're in a different world here. The setting is obviously not Earth.
Yeah. So here's some more just kind of series overall. You get some world hopping. Stephen King has set up this like multiverse where all of his books are set in different worlds, and there's a lot of fan theories and speculation about which characters and which books happen in the same world as which other ones. And then there's a keystone world that is our world, that is like our specific world that Stephen King is like sitting there writing, typing away on his computer in our world. And so our world is in there too. And then there's other worlds. And then there's the world that Roland starts out in.
So wait, so you're saying Stephen King types himself into the stories? He's a character?
Okay, so this is one of those spoilers we talked about, but Stephen King is a very important character in this series. Yes,
Really? Okay,
yes,
interesting.
yes. He is a vitally important character in the Dark Tower series.
Is his name Stephen King?
His name is Stephen King. It has real life events from his life that are incorporated into the series.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So if you know anything about Stephen King, he had a pretty bad accident. I think in the early 2000 or like in 2000 or 1999, where he got hit by a car and almost died. And that event is kind of foundational in the later books of the series.
Okay.
So
So, do you enjoy him being in there, or is this just completely like pompous and I'm Stephen King, so I'm putting myself in the book because I'm awesome?
I mean, yeah, like both. Yeah, like at times you're like, this is genius, and other times you're like, I can't believe you have such a big ego, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it is done well, though. I will give it that. It is done very well. And at first, I didn't think, I was like, how is he going to pull this off? And he, in my opinion, pulls it off well.
Okay, I'm very intrigued by that. That is something that I've not heard in another series
So,
before.
so picture kind of like you've read a series of unfortunate events.
Yep.
I mean, they kind of do the same thing with that, where you have
Okay.
Lemony Snicket is like the author, but it's not the actual author. But like as a kid, you like kind of think, wait, the author is Lemony Snicket, right? Like
Yeah.
you know that it's another author, but like you don't want to believe it's another author. You want to believe it's Lemony Snicket, and he kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
writes
yeah.
himself into the story.
That series does it brilliantly. I love that series, and I love how it does that. Although it gets a little weird by the end, and I didn't like how things were purposely left open and never wrapped up. That was
Yeah,
disappointing.
yeah, okay, but so that's actually I hadn't thought about that before starting the podcast, but that is a good comparison to how it's done well, and it's done in a similar way in both series, where it starts to get more and more. You realize, like, holy cow, the author is incorporating himself into the series, but because it's Stephen King, he goes way above and beyond what series of Unfortunate Events does.
Interesting. Okay, so Stephen King is a character, Roland is a character, the Man in Black is a character, but not the Man in Black from The Princess Bride, right?
Not the Man in Black from The Princess Bride. Nope.
And it sounds like you've described some events that maybe happen in the movie adaptation.
Yeah, so I saw the movie adaptation when it came out, and I want to watch it again, having read the series, but I don't remember a whole lot from it, to be honest.
That movie had Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey, right? So I'm assuming a pretty big budget.
Oh yeah, huge budget. I think why it was criticized because it really leaned into the multiverse aspect of Stephen King, and I think that a lot of people weren't really expecting that or ready for that, and it was a big departure because the first book in the series doesn't lean into that a whole lot, but that movie does. So I want to go back and see what my thoughts are about that movie after having watched the series or having read the series.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't seen the movie. I'm just kind of riffing, just hoping that I'm saying something intelligent.
No, you are. So we move on, and another character is also introduced in this first book, and that is Jake Chambers. And that's kind of this introduction of this little family that Roland is accumulating on his journey to the Dark Tower.
So why is he going to the Dark Tower? Is that a spoiler? Is that something important for the plot?
The Dark Tower has is like a magnetic, has kind of like almost a magnetic pull for Roland, and he just knows that he's supposed to go there. So some
Hmm.
larger Stephen King multiverse talk is the Dark Tower is supposedly like a physical manifestation of the creator of all the multiverse. So it's kind of like God incarnate, if you will, and he believes that the Dark Tower is like coming under attack, and he just knows he needs to get there.
Okay, so it sounds like at least for the initial books, he's going to the Dark Tower. We're not sure why, but is it ever explained at the end, or
I don't want to get into that.
something must be resolved, right?
There, I don't want to.
Interesting. Okay, sounds
Yeah,
like this is a very unique series. If you can't even say anything there.
yeah. There are resolutions that happen in the series. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't want to get into that too much because I don't want to give end of series spoilers or plot point spoilers, but you do learn more about why Roland needs to get to the Dark Tower and what he's going to do once he gets to the Dark Tower. So you learn that throughout all the books.
Okay, so this series is pretty long. There are 7, 8 books you said, and I know they get longer in terms of page count. The first few are not as long. The plot that you just described doesn't sound like something that would be an epic fantasy. This sounds like a one book plot, from my understanding at least. So there must be other things going on, or there must be like some kind of meta stuff that really kind of makes it.
Well, picture Frodo getting the ring, goes on a quest. Like all he's doing is getting the ring to Mordor, right? Like that's his quest.
Okay.
And then he goes and he picks up companions along the way, right?
Okay.
And then he immediately like picks up Sam and the other hobbits, and then he goes and they form the Fellowship of the Ring, and then they go and they all go kind of on those side quests, and then he gets to Mordor and throws the ring in the volcano. Like that's kind of what it is.
Spoilers for Lord of the Rings
Okay,
if you haven't seen it yet.
or read it.
Right.
Yeah, so you get that where it's kind of a similar type thing where here's the guy going to the Dark Tower because it's important that he gets there.
But in Lord of the Rings, we have an expansive cast of characters that picks up on the plot goes as the plot goes on. You have, the conflict with Sauron and Gondor and Rohan have all their people, and there's these epic battles. But it sounds like from your description that this series does not have that same expansion in terms of characters, at least.
So that's a good thing to bring up. So there are different villains that are picked up along the way. Randall Flagg, if you've seen other Stephen King adaptations, is the man in black that was originally that he's chasing after. So that's kind of a big bad throughout the series. There's individual kind of villains that they have to take out in each book that they have to go up against. Yeah, so there are different villains and different obstacles that they have to overcome throughout the books. So the other thing is that there's more characters that are introduced in the second book. There's a cast of what becomes what's called the quartet in world, where it's Roland, and this is going to be where I talk about some other characters that are introduced in the series. So there's Roland and Jake, which are introduced in the first book, and then there's Susanna and Eddie, Dean, and Oi, which is like a little dog that can kind of talk. So you have that kind of set of five that is some of the best character work and relationships that I've ever read, I think.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, he does an amazing job. Like full on that core group of five like becomes a family and has seriously just amazing relationship and character building throughout those five characters.
So, what type of characters are we expecting here? Typically, with a small group of companions, you'd have a lot of humor, kind of some slapstick stuff back and forth.
Yeah.
But it sounds like maybe this is more serious or funny, or
So I'll give a little one sentence overview of each of them. Roland is very serious, driven. He is just hyper focused on the Dark Tower. You got Jake, who is, I believe, 10 or 11 when the series starts out, a young kid who is pulled into this. Then you get Roland pulls in from different worlds. He pulls in Eddie, who is a drug addict, who is a recovering drug addict, I should say, and has kind of that slapstick humor, kind of like this irreverent humor to him.
okay.
You have Susanna, who is a black woman from the 60s or 70s, so like she was like involved in the civil rights movement, and she also has a split personality. So she has in the first book she's in, which is the second book, she has like one personality which is like hateful and vindictive, and one which is like really nice and sweet.
Huh.
And then you pick up Oi, which is kind of the lovable little animal sidekick that really bonds to Jake, the 10-year-old kid.
Okay. Sounds like several different characters here. And I can see that if those different personalities were to all come together, that could make for some really interesting and nice relationships.
Yeah. And it's interesting because throughout the second book, when all these characters are introduced, like each one of them, I kind of had reasons why I hated them as a character. Like there were things that annoyed me about them a lot. And then they don't really change, but he does them so well that you grow to love them. And they do grow and have like character arcs in meaningful ways. So I shouldn't say that they don't change, but like the core of why I initially didn't like them, like that didn't really change. But they just become such like a fleshed out character that you just really grow to love the character.
Nice. I love books that have really relatable characters. That's why I love Stormlight Archive so much. I feel like those guys are my friends, kind of same with Wheel of Time. So I imagine when you finished reading the series, did it kind of feel like you were parting from these guys?
Oh yeah, in big ways. Like I'm still kind of in this little because I just finished yesterday, so this is still kind of raw, but I still have this end of book depression where I'm like wishing I could jump back into these characters' lives, and so I'm going to go back and read some of the comics. I'm excited for that.
Okay.
yeah, it's you do get that longing to be back with these characters.
That's an awesome. I mean, that alone is an awesome recommendation, at
Yeah,
least.
for sure, in my opinion, the reason that you should read the series is to get the character work from the quartet, from this group of people that come together. And Stephen King just does such an amazing job. And that is Stephen King's biggest strength as an author, honestly, is how he can take these characters that have like these terrible flaws about them and just make you understand them in a way that you grow to love them despite their huge, massive shortcomings. And you don't necessarily even forgive them for those. You just still love them as a character.
Solid. Okay.
Yeah.
That's very intriguing to me. Let's move off characters. What have we touched on? We kind of touched on setting a bit. Maybe tell us about the prose. I mean, Stephen King, so I'm assuming the prose is going to be pretty solid.
Prose is solid. Prose is, yeah, I mean, again, if you've read Stephen King, then you know what to expect going into this. So the prose does an amazing job at creating the setting. It's kind of like Loch Lamora or Gentlemen Bastards of how every word that's like said seems to contribute to this setting that Stephen King is creating. He has a lot of in-world swears and in-world terms that contribute a lot to that as well. So I know you're a big fan of that, Stephen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just start another Joe Abercrombie thing since I'm on a Joe Abercrombie kick right now. But I think it's the same there, where just the way that he writes and the way that he structures sentences and chooses one word over another to describe something, in that case, contributes to a really gritty, grimdark feel. So it sounds
Yeah,
like you're saying same here,
yeah,
contributes to this kind of like off brand horror fantasy, is my vibe of how you're describing it.
and he does such a good job. I will say that sometimes I get annoyed with some things. Like sometimes there's just things that seem like a 15-year-old kid wrote them, like potty humor and like just these kind of weird things that
Okay.
I didn't love, but it still manages to contribute to this setting that is being built.
So I know that when he first wrote the series, he said he he considered it an initial draft, and he was planning on going back and touching things up. So did it seem like it was a little rough around the edges? Because that sounds kind of like what you're saying.
I'd say the first book, I don't know. I don't think he really had the well, he never had the rest of the series planned out. That's what you kind of figure out as you go throughout reading the series. And we'll talk about how I guess the series is structured too. Is he never knew what was going to happen next, really, in these books.
That's a little scary.
I mean, I think he might have had like the end. I don't know. I really don't know. But it was done well. So, for example, the ending between books 3 and 4, I believe, like he just stopped the book. It didn't end. It just stopped. Like there was no ending to the book that was written.
And you said that was a massive cliffhanger, right?
I don't even know if it was like a cliffhanger. Like, I mean, yeah, it kind of was. Like the heroes are all on their like hurtling towards what could be their death, and they have to do something to stop that, and it just ends like mid scene, basically.
So rising action ending. Interesting. I don't think I've ever read that before.
Yeah, and so here's where like the series is kind of structured like that. Like chapters will end like that, where it'll just be like almost mid scene, stop, and then just like pick up somewhere else on somebody else's point of view, and just it's kind of jarring to read sometimes. And he does the whole series like that.
So, do you appreciate that? Do you think it adds to the feel of the series? Some authors will structure their series like that, where they have like a ton of really short chapters, or the way they write is really choppy, like in Red Rising. But maybe it sounds like you thought this was a little too much.
So at times within the book, I really liked it, and Stephen King does that with a lot of his books, where he'll just stop mid scene and switch over to another character. And I think that a lot of times he does it really well, and it works for me. Sometimes it doesn't, but that's going to be the case. But in terms of like some things in the story, I think he just didn't know what was going to happen next, and he kind of builds this whole narrative into like the character of Stephen King in the book. So there's a lot of like Inception things happening where like I don't want to get too far into spoilers, but like he builds these reasons why he stopped the book like this into this series as a whole, but I don't think it was planned like that.
Huh. Okay. Sounds very cerebral here.
Yeah,
So the author is explaining why the book is written, why it is, and he's a character in the book.
yeah. So the character in the book is explaining why the who is the author is explaining why the author stopped writing or wrote it the way that it's written.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And so there are times when I felt like he was trolling fans almost, like with that scene with the stop between books 3 and 4, I believe. And then it took him 6 years to come out with the next book. And even the resolution was like, in my opinion, a really dumb resolution. Like if he was going to write that resolution, he should have just written it. It wasn't like this wasn't worthy of the 6 year break. So
Huh.
there are things that like really bugged me about it, like that. And he had like a foreword in one of the books, or maybe it was an afterword, but where he talked about this like lady who wrote from like her deathbed asking how this particular plot point was resolved, and like he wrote back saying I don't know, I would tell you if I knew but I don't. So there are some things like where he's comes out and says that they weren't planned out, and I don't know how much was planned out, how much wasn't, but like so there are these plot elements where he just said the book was done, it wanted to be done, I sent it into the publisher and they published it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Imagine if Patrick Rothfuss or George R. R. Martin were to come out with their next book after 9
Oh,
years and for it to just be
um,
complete garbage.
so this was still the
No,
90s.
no way could they get away with that.
So I don't want to imply that like there's any one book that was complete garbage. Like that is not the case. You know, like even those books, they weren't garbage by any means. They were still, building these spectacular characters. I loved a lot of things about them. But yeah, like the ending of that book, in my opinion, was garbage. And
Hmm.
so yeah, there would be massive, massive backlash today in a way that I don't think really happened in the 90s because there weren't these online communities as much in the 90s as there are now.
Yeah, maybe people were IMing each other with their frustration over book
On
four.
AOL. Yeah, there's like
Uh
some
huh.
AOL group about Stephen King.
You've got mail. Stephen
Yeah.
King rant thread.
So I don't know. In a lot of ways, yeah, it felt like he was trolling fans. And even the ending of the series. So Stephen King does not do endings well, in my opinion. I think that almost every book I read, the worst thing about it was the ending.
Oof.
Which that sounds bad, but Stephen King does so many things like spectacularly that like his worst part isn't like terrible. Like it just doesn't satisfy me completely.
Hmm.
Which like maybe that's what he's good at, is leaving you a little bit unsatisfied.
I mean, he's writing horror books, so the ending shouldn't feel too nice. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a difference between nice and satisfying, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm just trying to come up with something to excuse this.
Well, so we get to the ending of the Dark Tower, and there's kind of three different endings to this, and then you get to the epilogue, and there's one thing where I thought, okay, this is what everybody's upset with. That wasn't too bad. I kind of liked it. I actually really liked that part of that ending. And then the epilogue happens, and then we get another ending, and I'm like, okay, that's a great ending. And then we get the final ending, and Stephen King like says, stop reading. Like basically, he does kind of like a Lemony Snicket type thing where he's like, you don't want to keep reading.
I love that. Yeah, I love those
Yeah,
Lemony Snicket parts in
yeah.
his series. Yeah.
But it's like legit. Like he's like, I've given you your ending that you want. This is like you should just kind of stop reading now. And then you're like, obviously, I'm not going to stop reading, right?
Well, why? Yeah, why didn't you stop? I mean, he told you to stop.
Okay, I'm telling you right now, stop there. Just stop there. Because then you get the ending, which is what everybody freaks out over. And there's massive, people love it, people hate it. I go in between. I want to read more because I know that there's probably massive fan theories. So maybe once I read those, I might like it more. But just stop there, I'd say, unless you're ready to be disappointed.
I mean, I have no idea what the ending is, but it sounds like this is kind of like Lord of the Rings, where there are multiple endings, and it drags on and on and on, and you get everyone's resolution, and then you're saying at the very end everything is completely undone, or things are just changed, and it's crazy. But I guess we shouldn't speculate too much because it sounds like massive spoilers.
Yeah, massive spoilers. So I don't want to give anything away. One thing is that it doesn't drag on a whole lot. Like things happen fast, and that's kind of a thing of Stephen King is when things happen, like they happen pretty fast, and so there's no dragging on throughout the last kind of 5% of the book. Things happen really fast, but yeah, there's the last thing that happens is just be ready to have opinions, and you will have opinions.
And it sounds like Phantology listeners can hear your raw opinions on Patreon, right?
Yeah, if you want to hear my raw opinions, full of spoilers, if you've read the series or if you just don't care about spoilers, go listen to it. Although my opinions aren't satisfying because I have very conflicting opinions about it, so you'll be left unsatisfied from my opinions, I'm sure as well. But that's kind of how Stephen King likes to make you feel, I guess.
Okay, so if you want a unfiltered rant from Josh with a low amount of coherency, is what I'm hearing, then check it out on Patreon.
Check it out on Patreon. So, why you should read the series? I know I've harped on this, but seriously, some of the best character work I've read, bar none. It's kind of like Harry Potter, where you have like those Harry, Ron, and Hermione are just such a good trio, and they just work so well together. And you'll always remember that. That is like almost what the level of this group of cast of characters, core cast of characters in the Dark Tower did for me. If you like subversion of tropes, come read the Dark Tower. If you like to expand your fantasy horizon to encapsulate kind of everything that's out there, come for the Dark Tower. If decisions annoy you and they really annoy you, then stay away from the Dark Tower, I guess.
Sounds like something that I would read and I would love it, but I would have major issues.
You would have issues.
It sounds like you have a similar opinion. You
Yeah,
loved it, but you have issues.
for sure. So I'd say if you're a big Stephen King fan and for whatever reason have been intimidated by the length of the Dark Tower and have not read it, you need to go read it if you're a Stephen King fan. If you're even mildly like a Stephen King fan, then just go read it because it is long and it does get longer, but they're digestible. You know, they really are.
Would you say this is his magnus opus, if I have that term
Yeah,
correctly?
yeah. I mean, people online refer to it as his magnus opus because he doesn't do a series really at all. Like he has some sequel, like Doctor Sleep is a sequel to The Shining, and he might have other sequels, but he doesn't really do like long series. He does like in-depth character studies and books, and they're usually pretty good. But as far as I know, he doesn't really do more than one or two books in a specific franchise. So this, yeah, in a way, is his magnus opus.
Okay, Josh, anything else we need to know about the Dark Tower?
It's a trip, and you'll love it. You'll love some parts of it, and you'll I'm sure you will hate other parts of it. And Stephen King pulls off. I will say that he pulls things off in ways that other authors just could not or would not even try and do. Stephen King goes ahead and does them because he's one of the best-selling authors of all time, really, and he can.
Yeah, imagine that. Imagine being so successful that pretty much whatever you write, you can write yourself into the story and have yourself be a character, and no one's even going to think twice. It's like, okay, yep, the next Stephen King we're publishing. Here we go.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that his publisher will put out whatever he decides to write. They just will do it. So, if you listeners like Stephen King, I've read a lot. We can do more of these of Stephen King reviews if we get a good response to this. I'm happy to sit down and give my thoughts about other Stephen King's books, and we can have somebody else read them. But for now, I think that this will be our primary Stephen King review on here.
Yeah, hop on Discord if you're a fan and let us know what other books we should read. But also, you're reading The Stand right
Oh
now.
yeah, that's right. With everything that's going on, I hadn't read The Stand before all this COVID stuff, and so Jake and I are reading The Stand. We're gonna. That is a very long book. I think it's like 1,200 pages because we have the
Holy cow.
yeah. So Stephen King breaks his books up into books. So the ending of book one kind of deals with an outbreak, and that kind of happens in the first book within The Stand. And so I finished it. I think Jake's finishing it. He's supposed to finish it this week. So we're going to jump on and review the first book and within The Stand. Hopefully that'll come out soon.
Yeah, we got to get that out before the COVID thing blows over and no one cares anymore.
Yeah. But that's another book where Stephen King does some pretty amazing character work in it.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks, Josh. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for educating me a bit because this is a whole subgenre of fantasy that I'm completely oblivious to. And I guess if I want to say that I'm a host on a fantasy book podcast, I got to educate myself, right?
You know, I'm not a fan of gatekeeping because it took me a while to read The Wheel of Time, and I felt like I was precluded from partaking in serious fantasy conversations. And then after I read it, like I do feel like I can contribute more towards these kind of conversations. However, I don't feel like anything should really be a gatekeeper. Like if you've read fantasy, you've read fantasy, and you're allowed to have opinions on it. But I don't think that should preclude you from having your valid opinions about several other fantasy works.
Thank you for that message of inclusivity from Phantology.
Yep, that is our official position as of Ventology. Is if you're a fan, you're allowed to be a fan, and you're allowed to have opinions. That's my official stance on this.
Totally agreed. 100%. All right. Thanks for listening. Let us know what you'd like us to read next and look for that review of The Stand coming soon. I guess we're just on a little bit of a Stephen King trip here. So let us know if you like that. And if you like what we put out, check us out on social media at Phantology Books and at www.phantologybooks.com. All right. Thanks, Josh. We'll see you later.
Thanks, Stephen.